Good morning, St. John's. We have a real treat for you today with Ray Suarez. He is our friend. He's led our men's retreats, but most importantly, he comes, and I look forward to this every year, to give us some reflections. This is at this time of Advent when we're thinking about the coming of Jesus, about Christmas, about who we are as Christians. I can't think of a better person really to give some thoughts about all of these things than Ray. He's been a broadcast journalist, a writer in the national spotlight for over a quarter century. You remember he was chief national correspondent of the PBS NewsHour. He was host of on NPR of Talk of the Nation. He's written numerous books. He is currently doing the radio program and podcast called On Shifting Ground. And his book, his latest book, one of many, is a fascinating one, just put out in April by Little Brown. It's called We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, an Oral History, about, and I'll let him talk about that more certainly, but about how we are a land of immigrants, all of us, our strength, our salvation. And he really lets the voices of so many people across the United States speak. He brings to us such humanity, such humor, such humility. Fellow Episcopalian Ray Suarez.
It's great to be back with you. I hope the beginning of another church year and the close of another secular year find you healthy and whole and in happy anticipation of another Christmas and New Year. In a few weeks, a new president takes office, and one of his central promises is to radically re-engineer how immigration to the United States is managed from the US side of the border. Some of these proposals, like ending birthright citizenship, like reimposing the Muslim ban, a name he didn't like, but it was really exactly that, only passing Supreme Court muster when a few token non-Muslim countries like Venezuela and North Korea were added to the list, like deporting whole families, including family members who are citizens, in the name of family unity, like ending temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of people who've been living peaceably among us, seeking refuge from some of the most disorderly and dangerous places on the planet. These proposals, taken individually or as a whole, seem designed to thrill one group of Americans and horrify another. From the outset, there's been no effort to find some sort of consensus, some sort of common ground. That's not really the flavor of the month in January 2025. What I have to remind you at the outset is that every country on earth has the right, the obligation to control its borders, has the right to create rules and regulations governing the way people arrive in the country, and the rules and requirements for those arrivals who seek to stay temporarily or permanently. But events do intervene. You've got an ideal world where you set up rules and regulations, and then life happens. Two things pushed me to start writing this book. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, more on that later, and the global refugee crisis made worse over the last decade by the continued meltdown of countries like Burma, Venezuela, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and most recently, Syria and Ukraine. I kind of Ouija'd this book into place in response to different impulses coming from events, coming from our politics, driven increasingly by the shifting tone in the American conversation over immigration. It's been contested terrain for a while. We as a people for a long time have been arguing about what to do with the people who are here with no legal right to live here, work here long term, a population that's grown steadily in the decades since the Simpson-Mazzoli Law, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, that offered a path to legal residence for millions of undocumented people, amnesty. Now, more than 35 years later, there are many millions. It's hard to say how many, maybe 12 to 15 million people living here with no legal status, millions more who have come in legally, millions more who are trying to come in, and the United States is a country changed by their presence. Still, it's recognizably the United States. We're still us, and still different. People might think back to that 1986 law as a big milestone in that transformation, but the real change goes back to 1965 and the Hart-Celler Law. It was a much bigger deal that helped turn the axis of American immigration away from Western Europe-centered quota systems in place since the 1920s, that along with other rules already in place, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917. There isn't going to be a quiz, don't worry. These effectively closed the United States to much of the world. American opinion makers in the 1920s were really disturbed, unhappy with the human waves that had washed up in this country from the mid-1840s to the early 1920s and brought with them what they regarded as alien religions, alien ideas, alien political theories. And the Congress at that time just basically said, all right, that's it, no more of that, and slammed the door. That much Congress could control. What the following decade and a half brought were things Congress couldn't control. Worldwide economic depression, followed by a decade of world war, and a baby boom in America that was now home to half of the industrial productivity on the planet. The 1910 census, taken as a new anti-immigrant consensus was building in the country, found about 1 in 7 people living in America was born in another country. So 1910, 1 in 7 Americans born in another country. By 1960, it was 1 in 20. Because people hadn't been coming in large numbers in a long time, the US had essentially digested, absorbed that big early 20th century immigrant wave. And the average foreign-born person in America in 1960 was far older than the average American. Today, we talk about immigrants as younger workers, and we talk about their children heading to kindergarten. In 1960, immigrants were your grandma and grandpa, not a 20-something new arrival trying to get a job at your company. The birth countries of foreign-born Americans had sent immigrants to the US were almost entirely white in 1960. So the top 10 birth countries of foreign-born Americans in 1960 were Germany and Ireland and Canada. By the 2020 census, if you looked at the top 10 birth countries of foreign-born Americans, 9 of them sent exclusively non-white immigrants to the United States, and 1, Canada, was sending increasingly non-white immigrants to the United States. People of East Asian, African, and Caribbean descent were coming in from Canada. In the book, we hear new stories from new Americans from every corner of the globe about their journeys to this country, their struggles, how they got the hang of being American. Why? Why? Because much of the anti-immigrant rhetoric you hear in this country is based on the idea that new people will never get the hang of being American. That they are criminals, that they are diseased, that they don't learn English, that they are, like all immigrants, sure, by definition, foreign, but in a weird way, too foreign to learn how to be like us. When I watched thousands of young white men marching around a statue of Robert E. Lee chanting, "You will not replace us," and more ominously, "Jews will not replace us," I felt sorry for these young men and sorry about their presence in Charlottesville for a couple of reasons. For the one thing, the you that will not replace them, it's me. I get that. My wife, my kids, and these men who believe strongly that they are patriots. They know their own country, the country they purport to love, as a zero-sum game, a place where someone else's progress and productivity means there is less for them. It's a departure from centuries of what our patriots believed about the country, that the miracle of the place is that it's not a zero-sum game. I have no doubt that if I had been in Charlottesville that night as a reporter and worked the line with a mic or a notepad, I would have run into some number of Clarks and Smiths and Jenkins, but also on that line absolutely would have been Vogels and O'Learys and Santellas and Grabowskis. They would be the descendants of people who came here and for a long time experienced marginalization and exclusion because some of them, their own forebears, weren't, strictly speaking, in the racial pseudoscience of the day, white people. Today, seeing themselves as powerful and superior and at the same time threatened, their own understanding of their own American past would neatly edit out the ways their own ancestors were allowed to join the mainstream. And it would set aside what the identity their own forebears would have carried in the eyes of 19th and 20th century nativists as Slavs, as Irish, as Southern Europeans, Italians, Romanians. Not good stock from which to build a great nation. These young men have so little faith in America, so little grasp of our history, that they believe the great transformation, the amazing metamorphosis that made Americans out of their own ancestors, is somehow a process that we can no longer manage with people named Lopez or Hernandez or Chang or Suleiman. Furthermore, in the uglier, deeper recesses of the Great Replacement theory, is that powerful, moneyed elites are engineering large-scale immigration to the US in order to steal their inheritance. The birthright of those aggrieved young men that effort to steal their birthright is being engineered by shadowy Jewish forces who secretly and not so secretly run the country. It's a deluded, hateful, cramped, mean, dysfunctional belief to carry into the rest of this century. It seeks to outright negate or somehow make suspicious and ugly the contributions new Americans make to getting the daily work of the country done. Whether it's picking your strawberries and milking your cows, or bussing your restaurant tables, or pounding your roof shingles, or inventing the future in Silicon Valley, or in a human genome lab in Boston. A few years ago, I was in a garage in one of dozens of small cities on the southern end of Los Angeles County. Earlier in the day, I had visited a metal stamping shop, a parts factory in an industrial zone. It's the kind of place that you don't even consciously think of as existing in the economy. Yes, somebody has to make the hoods for fluorescent fixtures, but until somebody says, I make the hoods for fluorescent fixtures. You really don't think about them getting made or who does it. I met a young man who had sneaked into the country from Mexico with his family years before, and his boss, who was willing to stick his neck out by vouching for the young man's employment. Fernando Fuentes arrived in the country as a teenager. The work I watched him perform at the shop, using a multi-ton turret press to fashion sheet metal into components for commercial lighting fixtures, showed he was good with his hands. He was grateful that his boss, who might have suspected he was not in the country legally, was willing to complete the paperwork that allowed Fuentes to stay. That, however, is not really what got the young man beaming, got his pulse pounding, got him talking excitedly with rising enthusiasm and pleasure about his work. That's what got us into the garage. Fuentes had a side hustle, taking ordinary used automobiles and turning them into tricked out works of art. He taught himself customization while working at the stamping plant. And now he did it all. Neon lights, audio systems, upholstery, paint. He had just finished his latest creation, and in that California garage, Fuentes cranked up the audio, showed me how the colored lights pulsed and changed colors in time with the music. He flipped open the trunk and showed off his skills with both sewing black leather and nestling speakers in custom carpeting. This is where Fuentes saw his future. He grinned as he showed me his recently issued driver's license, his Social Security card, and explained with relief that he wasn't going to live in the shadows anymore. He said, "I'm not going to be hiding from anywhere, and I'm going to keep on doing the right thing." And that's where you hear that sound effect of screeching brakes. I'm going to keep on doing the right thing. And a lot of Americans would say, but hey, wait a minute, he's not even supposed to be here. Him coming here in the first place was not the right thing. That was illegal. He's got to go. When you cover public policy for a living, you have to think through an encounter like this one. Did Fuentes break the law when he came to the United States years earlier? Yes, without a doubt. Did he receive services from the state of California, like public schooling, that imposed a cost on the taxpayers that those taxpayers did not explicitly agree to take on? Yes, absolutely. Then how should a society respond? What's the best play for a country that's looking at a proud, smiling Fernando Fuentes in an LA County garage, flipping switches to show a visitor the light show he created? Now that he is a tax-paying worker, working at a local business and starting one of his own, if we were to make our decisions strictly on legal grounds and send him home, who would benefit? Well, arguably, Mexico would benefit and not California. The question is not entirely about making judgments on the infractions of the past. The boy who was spirited over the border at 12 is now a man. What now? Our country has nothing to gain and a lot to lose by sending Fuentes packing. We did not ask for or authorize his presence among us. He took something he was not allowed to take, but he is here. He works 60 hours a week, doing one of the jobs, the tens of millions of jobs most of us don't even know exist consciously. As I mentioned in the opening paragraphs of the book, I wrote a lot of it while I was living in China, a country that's made very different choices about immigration. China's birth rate has cratered. The country is now losing population. In coming decades, it will have severe troubles producing its food and manufactured goods and recruiting for the People's Liberation Army. One of the places I've talked about the difference between the US and China when it comes to immigration is China. Earlier this year, I spoke at the US consulate in Shanghai. Place was packed with an all-Chinese audience. with a sizable portion of the audience having relatives living in the United States. I mentioned in my talk that attitudes toward immigration were historically very different from China's. And I said that without fear of contradiction. And one Chinese attendee, when we got to Q&A, doubted that was true. I could only reply with a quick point. I talked about how my Shanghai neighbors were very well aware, extremely well aware, that on the second floor of number 66 Uyuan Lu was a foreigner, me. And they saw me shopping in the stores, and they saw me bringing my dry cleaning home. They were very well aware there was a foreigner on the second floor of number 66. And if I had lived there another 30 years, become fluent in Chinese, worked in the local economy, I still, at the end of those 30 years, would have been the foreigner on the second floor in number 66. No one would refer to me as Chinese ever. And she had to concede those things were true. At our first reluctant, then begrudging, then serially repeated great talent as a people has been to gather in newcomers from everywhere and watch them become us. And no matter how aggrieved you are, young man, about a future where you will not be a member of a presumed majority, large and in charge of everything, the country will still be itself, will still know itself. We have to work on that asymmetry where they have trouble seeing me as part of their America, and I have no problem seeing them as part of mine. One thing I write about extensively in the pages of this book is the way immigration is transforming the religious life of this country. For much of American history, patterns of immigration acted as a proxy for race, and in turn, race acted as a proxy for religion. In much of the modern era, Americans have spoken with great affection of the country's immigrant past. You've seen those sepia-toned photographs of people coming in at Ellis Island. We love those people. We like to think that throughout the nation's history, immigration is, in fact, the engine that created the country's unique diversity, and to be sure, that is somewhat true. In practice, however, only white immigrants were able to become citizens of the United States. And, you know, history isn't bad, history isn't good, history just is. From the Declaration of Independence until the 1870s, only white people could become citizens of the United States. It's just the way things were. They're not like that anymore. Yay, us. But that's the deal. Those post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution were written to clear away legal impediments for the sons and daughters of Africa born on American soil to be considered citizens of the states in which they resided and citizens of the United States. But again, by using that language, aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent, it's right there in the amendment. We've opened that privilege of becoming an American, but only part way in those post-Civil War amendments. But if you add to those post-Civil War amendments the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the practice of gradually raising barriers to Japanese migration and naturalization to the Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims around the world who were blocked from naturalization, not by virtue of their religion, but by virtue of their race and countries of origin. These lurk in tiny 8-point type lines in our law, all the way deep into the 20th century. We did not have in statute that we wanted Christian immigrants only, But by first putting out the welcome mat for, then writing into practice and statute that we wanted mainly European immigrants, it was predictable that the United States would become a country of Christians with a small scattering of Jews. Muslims and others were brought to the United States, certainly throughout our history, but in the holds of ships coming from West Africa as property. And they were, in large numbers, converted to Christianity. So even as a nation of immigrants, this country, as late as 1965, was almost entirely Christian, with a small, steady Jewish minority, mostly east of the Mississippi. By opening up the map of the world, by junking the Asiatic Barred Zone Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, by getting rid of the 1924 quotas and formulas and bringing in more people from Asia, East and South, from Africa and Latin America, we remade the demographics of American religion in a few short years, even as at the same moment, Americans of longer family histories were walking away from the religions of their forebears. So an interesting thing is happening. Native-born Americans are either leaving religion altogether or changing the religious practice of their own family's heritage, as for the first time, large numbers of non-Abrahamic believers are coming in, and for the first time, foreign-born Muslims are becoming a larger presence. The map's in motion. As the numbers of unaffiliated has grown, so has the number of Hindus, Muslims from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. As more and more Americans begin or continue their families' journeys in this country, not in religious and ethnic ghettos in cities, which was the pattern for the first 200 years of the country's existence, but now they begin that journey in suburbs. So if you go to Montclair, New Jersey, you'll see a high school filled with South Asians of various derivation. If you go to Monterey Park, California, it's basically a Chinese town in LA County. You see more and more people when they come to the United States not heading to LA and New York and Chicago and Miami, but to towns outside the core city of the metropolis. So Sikh gurdwaras, mosques, Buddhist temples, Spanish-speaking Pentecostal megachurches are joining the landscape along suburban arterial roads, standing right next door to or having their parking lots abutting up to First Presbyterian or Tabernacle of Hope, sort of non-denominational giant parking lot church. One of the places I take the reader in We Are Home is an enormous Hindu temple that rises from a vast parking lot in the Dallas suburbs. Another is a growing multinational immigrant Muslim congregation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and to a fascinating young Episcopal mission in Dearborn, Michigan, led by a young priest named Halim Shukair, a Lebanese VTS graduate who was asked by the Bishop of Michigan to grow an Arabic-speaking Episcopal congregation in a church whose foundation stone was laid by Mrs. Henry Ford. American history is phenomenal. Father Halim leads a religiously diverse Episcopal congregation drawn from Israel and Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. While almost all his flock was raised Christian, not a single one was raised in any branch of the Anglican Communion. So they're former Maronites and former Chaldeans and former Orthodox. He's working on an Arabic translation of the Book of Common Prayer. And in a very American move, he now has to add an English summary to his weekly sermon for the younger members of the congregation who can't always follow the whole thing in Arabic. It's a new story, and at the same time, a very old American story. One early winter, I killed time before an afternoon appointment in Minneapolis, sitting at a high counter in the window of a Starbucks, looking out at the Calhoun Square Mall. A black man in a long overshirt, a tobe, and a heavy jacket to hold off the early winter wind, his close-cropped hair topped by a knit kufi hat. He was stopping passersby to hand them Muslim literature. He stopped all kinds of people, people who might have apparently been interested and people who you might otherwise would think weren't very interested. He stopped them and then seemed to devote special attention to young adult men. Civil war in Somalia had sent people streaming out of that equatorial country in the 1990s, and the snowy Twin Cities became the home of the largest Somali community in the US, some 100,000 strong. And as I nursed my coffee and flipped through a magazine, I noticed his approach change. He no longer seemed to be primarily pressing leaflets into waiting hands. The tall, broad-shouldered, and gregarious street proselytizer had convinced a small group of people to stop on windy Hennepin Avenue, and he now led 2 short rows of men in afternoon prayer, Asr, one of the 5 appointed prayer times each day for observant Muslims. In unison, the men touched their head to the red brick paving stones in front of the mall. Minnesota, long kidded affectionately on public radio's Prairie Home Companion as the home of church suppers and covered hot dishes and Lutheran choirs and Midwestern Reserve and decidedly unshowy private religion, was now the home of something new. Some shoppers carrying bags from the mall stopped for a moment and watched this play out on Hennepin Avenue in respectful silence, watched a ritual that had traveled to Minneapolis from very far away. Others, who needed to get somewhere, politely stepped around the kneeling men in their short 2 rows on the sidewalk and headed to their next destination. This was only years after 9/11. And I wondered how well such a scene would play in other parts of this big and complicated country that are not as polite as Minnesota. If after I retire in the next few years, I could head to seminary for a graduate degree, I would want to watch closely what new Americans do. Will they, as they acculturate, as their tenures here in the US lengthen, as their children reach adulthood and have their own children, will they become religiously more like their native-born neighbors or remain somewhat distinct for a few more generations? That could mean, in one future, that they disaffiliate at a similar level to native-born Americans, even as they carry a distinctive set of facial features and skin tones into that future. They won't carry their ancestral faith. It could mean over time converting. One of the people I profile in the book is a deacon in an Ethiopian church. His youngest congregants are no longer familiar with the separate liturgical language used in Ethiopian worship. So even if you speak one of the ethnic languages of Ethiopia, you may not speak church language, Giz. Will they marry out? Will they join similar but more American congregations that worship in English? Will they marry Black Americans and become Baptist or AME congregants and still church affiliated? A Hindu mother of 2 college-age sons said she thought both of her boys will marry in the faith. I found her confidence very refreshing and a little surprising. She was very sure that they would marry in the faith. And if they didn't, she allowed that they would still remain Hindu. Her confidence buoyed by the families she sees at Temple, who I saw at Temple, with intermarried couples where both parents are encouraging their children in Hindu learning? Will a particularly American style of Islam grow in this country, one where more of the preaching and teaching goes on in English and Arabic prayer dwindles as part of observance? In what ways will Muslim immigrant families resemble Roman Catholic families earlier in American history, who built churches, brought in priests and nuns from faraway countries to keep a bit of Croatia or Poland or Italy or Ireland alive in church, and then find that ethnocultural orientation can't make the leap to the suburbs? It's all fascinating stuff. Some definite master's and doctoral projects waiting out there. It will make for great scholarship in coming decades, even as the country continues to become overall less religious. I don't know the neurology behind it, but I find myself getting incredibly sentimental as I get older. And at the same time, oddly, more hard-nosed and practical. And as both impulses intensify, I find, in a weird way, that they're not contradictory. In the final chapters of the book, I talk at length about American ideals, about the things that we tell ourselves we are, accepting and tolerant and believing in the future, and contrast that with the real situation we find ourselves in today and the yawning chasm between the real and the ideal, about the real need for workers and children to keep the lumbering, clanking machinery of a continent-sized country moving forward, about the need to avoid the kind of intergenerational demographic danger waiting in coming decades in China and South Korea and Russia and Ukraine, where it's not unusual to be in a large crowd of people and see no children. I want us to include a little thinking about social utility when it comes to immigration, about practical things like who do we think is going to take care of the largest generation of senior citizens in American history? In Japan, which accepts very few immigrants and makes it really hard to enter and stay, the fastest growing job for Japanese in their 60s and 70s is taking care of Japanese in their 80s and 90s. Along with the practical, hard-nosed, green eye shade calculation about alternative American futures, about the beautiful stories immigrants told me about becoming American and the things they learned along the way, there's got to be some kind of give in today's situation. And you watch out. You watch the first 6 months of the next presidential administration. All kinds of stuff is going to get tried. And the price that's going to be paid for it is vast, right now incalculable. Immigrants themselves are flexible, rolling with every punch America dishes out and becoming hermit crabs in a complicated country. The hermit crab, as it develops, creates a home by taking up residence inside whatever cast-off shell is available and makes it fit. All up and down the economy, in every kind of American community, from the biggest cities to the smallest rural settlements, immigrants make economies work. They're making homes for themselves, like the Dominicans of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, like the Somalis of Lewiston, Maine, in whatever place fits. For all the efforts in recent years to cast suspicion on motivation, acculturation, and their desire to become us, modern immigrants continue the alchemy of America, continue the amazing work of transformation that has marked this country for almost 250 years. Their children, a real estate agent in Texas, a business consultant in San Francisco, and an immigration attorney in Boston, a college professor in New York, a kid scooting around a dinette in a Queens apartment, whose parents are descendants of an ancient Jewish community on the Silk Road, which is now almost empty today, emptied out, making Tel Aviv and Queens, New York into an ark for Uzbek Jews. It's all just amazing. It's all stuff that we should remember about ourselves as we begin this new family fight about who belongs here and who gets to be us. You don't have to be a softie to get a little catch in your throat when you hear those words. We have been good at this. We have sometimes been mean and exclusionary and horrible, but we've often enough, compared to a lot of other societies on the earth, been very good at this. America 2.0 is coming. Ready or not, the cake is baked. You could slam the gates shut on the northern and southern border in Dulles Airport and in LAX and say, no more. The cake is baked. That majority-minority future is coming, whether we continue to accept immigrants or not. So what are we doing? Why are we embarking on another angry, vituperative, harmful family fight when that change is already in the making? You watch the rhetoric that people will use in the coming year about things like birthright citizenship, which was settled by the Supreme Court in the mid-1890s. And yet we seem to want to still have that fight over again. We are on the precipice, we are on the edge of an amazing and painful time. And I hope that we will find our ways to doing the right things, saying the right things. If past is prologue, we're going to try a lot of the wrong things first, and we're going to try a lot of the mean things first, and then figure out what really works. Thanks for having me with you today. Great to see you.
Wow, Ray, thank you. That was incredible. We have a couple minutes for some questions. Audience.
Hi, Dylan Gridham, history teacher. Only in one time, as far as I know, only in one time in history have more people left the United States than come here, and it was during the Great Depression. Do you see right now about 8 million Americans live abroad? Do you see a period in this next administration where Americans will leave in more numbers than arrive?
Oh, if middle class and upper middle class Americans, you would think the place would be empty. Sure, the area of Mexico and Costa Rica, people leave at a much lower rate than they say they're going to leave. One aspect of American immigration history very much talked about is I see. Is that a lot of people went home all along that big surge tide of immigration from Europe from the 1840s to the 1920s. It was a circular migration to a degree that I think a lot of people don't realize. Large numbers of people went back to Italy, went back to Ireland, went back to Canada. And in Italian, there's a saying, he who crosses the ocean gets a home. There was this idea that you would just sojourn in the United States, make some money and come back. If you go to small towns in central Mexico and see basketball courts and extensions on elementary schools and those kinds of things, it's built by immigrant money, often by people who went did what they had to do, and did come back. And certainly Mexican immigration has very much featured returning to Mexico, as the Mexican economy has offered more reliable wages for a lot of workers. You know, it's hard to leave everything you know, your whole family, the place you grew up, the people you love, your original language. And if you can make a living and you don't have to leave, a lot of people figure, okay, I did what I did and I'll go home. Norwegians who were sod busting in the Great Plains generally didn't go home because now they owned a farm. The weather was similar, but they had a farm. So they didn't go home, but a lot of Italians did, a lot of Irish did. And maybe a lot of people who've tried out America will decide that it's not really for them. One woman I talked to who was a member of the Armenian minority in Lebanon was just about to start college when her family, in the teeth of one of the Lebanese civil wars, decided this is just too much, we got to get out of here. And they went to Southern California, and she kind of hated it. And they went back to Lebanon when things calmed down. And then the next civil war started, and they said, no, sorry, we're out. So watch this space. I mean, the Trump administration wants to rescind temporary protected status for large numbers of people who've come here from places that are now, in the judgment of the incoming administration, okay again. I think okay again plots along a very broad continuum. There's nobody who would look at the Congo and say, oh yeah, that's okay. And say, okay, so now you're going to go home. But that will be a political as much as a practical decision. You know, if we get a Haitian government that's an operable, actual government, will we say to Haitians, okay, time to go home? During a Trump administration, we probably will. Certainly, there are people already looking at the TPS granted to the small number of Syrians that we've allowed in since the Civil War began, and starting to say, all right, well, that's over. Things are cool in Syria, and looking at sending them home. So it's really remains to be seen. But yeah, a lot of people have always gone home and probably will continue to go.
Thank you very much. My name is Josh Vanderplug. I'm a lawyer, and for the last 15 years, I've lived as an expat. We could have a whole conversation on the definition of expat versus immigrant, but that's a classist issue in my mind. One thing that you kind of were getting at, but didn't quite get to, I thought, was, you know, in the 1924 immigration quotas, I mean, you were using the term white to include Irish and Italians and Slavs. And my understanding is that those groups were actually not considered white in those days, but that over time, the definition of white has changed to include these groups. So do you think that this kind of assimilation will repeat itself a generation or two from now, so that we will kind of see, like, maybe not white, but certainly kind of like homegrown Americans to include groups that today might not be in that?
There's a whole other big fat book that's the answer to that brief question. In the early years of the 20th century, a congressional committee was formed called the Dellingham Commission. I speak about it briefly in the book. And they actually set out to establish, quantify, and define the races of man, and came up with a lot of things that we wouldn't recognize as races today, as was implied by your question. Here's how I would answer that. The subversion of the racial binary, that idea that you're either black or you're not, or you're either white or you're black, those ideas are going to have a very rough century, because obviously it's much more complicated than that. Um, Latinos, who now number 60 plus million, are the front edge of the subversion of the racial binary because they are multiracial, a multiracial group taken as a group with all kinds of strands in their DNA. I mean, Selma Hayek is a Lebanese person who grew up in Mexico. Is she indigenous? No, she's Lebanese. Shakira similarly, and yet this lump umbrella, this really not very well defined idea of some sort of shared ethnic origin has been gathering strength and definition in recent decades. One of the first Supreme Court cases to deal with this had to do with a young student in Oregon, Bhagat Singh Thind, who toward the end of the First World War enlisted in the US Army, was given permission by his unit to continue to wear his Sikh headgear. And he said, look, we come from a martial race and we've always worn these. And they kind of said, whoa, okay. And so there's pictures of him with his rifle and his doughboy's uniform and his turban. And at the end of the war, when they start to demobilize his unit, he says, okay, I want my American citizenship now because I read in the law that if you're an enlistee and you serve honorably and you're discharged when you're demobilized, you become a citizen. And they said, well, and he was given his citizenship, which was then rescinded because he wasn't white. He then goes to court and says, well, hey, wait a minute. I'm a Northern Indian, so I'm an Aryan from Punjab. And so, yeah, I am white. Interesting. Then the Supreme Court, contradicting its own ruling from just a few years earlier when a Japanese Presbyterian seminary student said, I'd like to be an American citizen, and they told him no. They said, well, you may be in some tricky definition white, but you wouldn't be accepted as white or thought of as white by the common man running into you on the street. So the Supreme Court gets into this hair splitting about who's white and who's not in like 1921. And who writes the majority opinion? An immigrant writes the majority opinion, Justice George Sutherland, but he happened to be an immigrant from like Derbyshire, so he was fine. Whiteness was adjudicated in dozens of cases because in much of the country in the early part of the century, whether you were white or not, dictated a lot of things, where you could go to school, where you could live, what facilities you could use. So people would actually go to court. A lot of the early court cases in the first decades of the 20th century on these matters were brought by immigrants from the Ottoman Empire who went to court to establish that they were white so they could own businesses and operate businesses in cities like Savannah and Richmond and New Orleans, where whiteness was an important thing to have codified in law. After the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s, it's less important. Now it's a social function more than a legal one. But it is a fascinating question, and a great big fat book would come out of the answer.
Let's have it. We need to wrap up. So if you want to come talk to Ray and buy one of his books, please do. He'll give you his signature. But a round of applause for what a wonderful